Hi, I'm Christy McDevitt, and I have Jaron here, and we're doing our lit review on ambitious science teaching. Um, so, Ambitious Science Teaching is a book that is involved in the scientific method in particular. So we have all been in a science classroom, and we've seen this kind of diagram, and we see that you go around and then you gather some data and then you go backwards. And this part right here is the really important part in science, but it's one that hasn't really hit the general public very well. So this is really important to consider because 36% of students who are in low minority high schools will not go to college immediately, and 48% of students who are in high minority schools will not go to college immediately. So for a lot of students, their high school science classes are the last time that they're seeing this scientific process. And we've already seen that that comes with a whole lot of consequences. So during the pandemic, what we saw was the general public watching science happen in real time. And it freaked out a lot of people in the way that science was not absolutely certain of anything. And so we really need to emphasize what the scientific process is and what it looks like. And AST is a great framework for doing that.
Quick overview of what AST kind of covers and is about is it's breaking that traditional framework of the traditional science K-12 system that was very unapproachable, just organized in a very regurgitated style of facts and definitions. Traditional style was very unadaptive, had clear learning goals that were dictated by the teacher. The students had very little say in anything, was disconnected in the students' day-to-day lives, and it was non-inclusive. It only focused on a few high-performing individuals. And a big push from AST is to contextualize these scientific concepts in phenomenons. So not just focusing on these big and in the sky phenomenon or concepts, but what they actually mean to people in their day-to-day lives. Using students as a resource, they come into the classroom with prior knowledge and focusing on building an intellectual community amongst the classroom for continuing that science learning process. And it focuses on what students do know, focusing on different ways you can assess that through not traditional test formats, different ways that they can prove their knowledge to you. So it goes through 4 different core practices. The first one is engagement, first and foremost. Your students are not going to learn anything if they don't care what they're learning about. So how do we change that? A lot of this is kind of on the planning end on your part, kind of making your lessons in ways that your students will be engaged. And one big way to do that is to ask these questions, not who, what, where, but why. Why are these things happening? Really focus on the connection of beginning, middle, and end, what is happening in the process, and have focusing on the students being able to explain that back to you in their own ways. So in the planning phase, how you do this is you pick the 2 or 3 big ideas. There'll be a lot of picking and choosing because there's a lot of ideas to pick from. And then some supportive ideas as far as how to get there. So you got to be really selective as far as what you want to focus on. You have to anchor these understandings in very practical context for your students. Give them an event that they can witness, they're interested in, that's very exciting, that they care about. A lot of times this will be a local type of phenomenon, very specific that they can focus on, that'll base their understanding about. And finally, how does that understanding change over time? All events have a starting point, they have a middle point, and they have an end. So how these phenomena change over time is kind of a framework that you'll be breaking down their learning.
So here's one of the phenomenon that you might choose. So this is a tanker implosion, which is for a chemistry and physics class and has also been used in middle school. So here we go. So you would show your students this. And the tanker imploded all of a sudden. So this is a really cool phenomenon that includes a whole lot of chemistry and physics and is one of the ones we'll be talking about as the phenomenon that can be explained through AST focus. Oh.
That's pretty cool. What student would not be interested in learning how that happens? So one of the major ways we engage our students is through conversations, group discussions, much like how we do in class. One big benefit of that is it builds community. It's not just a teacher reciting information to students and students secretly giving it back to the teacher. It's engaging everyone with each other. And the way that AST teaches this is through a process of scaffolding. So you'll lay down a set of rules, if you will, that they'll be following. Many of them are established by the class themselves, so it's not just all top down coming from you. So they've got a procedure, they've got a framework they're working from, with the intention that you can eventually, after kind of modeling and facilitating this framework, you can kind of step back. And it's a self-functioning thing. They're all talking with each other, kind of, again, buying that community buy-in, that they're all invested in their own learning. There's a lot of guiding tools, a lot of different strategies that this book kind of covers that you can use to kind of guide the conversations in ways that you want to, without being manipulative or doing things that you shouldn't be doing. One of the strategies introduces the think, pair, share. It's a very strategy that focuses on equity, so that way everyone has time to think about, think or write about what they want to share, have a small group conversation with it, and then present it to the class. That way everyone enters that group conversation with something to say. And this is a great way, the whole talk conversation, to approach these big scientific concepts that seem really unapproachable, but just kind of break them down into small parts that you can all talk about, reason through, and then before you know it, you've kind of talked about the whole thing as a class. One of the big takeaways, the benefits of these discussions, is it teaches your students not just the scientific concepts, but their own ability for self-advocacy. It promotes the democratic process of them having that whole conversation. It builds that intellectual community, and it gives them ownership on their own education, them being personally involved in these phenomena. Moving on to our next core practice is through different forms of modeling. We can move into the idea of eliciting ideas. So how do we get these ideas that our students have? And this is also sequenced kind of before, middle, and end, not only in the process of the phenomena we're explaining, but in the students' learning. So they come into the classroom with the beginning knowledge, their background knowledge, their cultural knowledge. They step in the classroom knowing some things. It might not be a full understanding. In fact, it likely is not, but they still know something. Even if it's as little as, I don't really know what's going on, but I think blank might be involved. If they can answer a question like that, they have something to start. Everyone comes into this space with some type of knowledge, and a focus on building these models is to emphasize there's no right model. A model is describing, again, the specific phenomenon, not a whole complex scientific process, but just one specific event. It'll have that sequencing, beginning, middle, end, and it's describing the student's way of thinking, their way of understanding it. So because of that, there is no right answer. And one key concept of these models is they'll be making one at the beginning, middle, and end, kind of revising it as they go. This can be a really scary concept, as a lot of times models, as you make them, or at least it's drilled into these students' heads, like has to be right. So getting that no right idea can be really challenging, but students can revisit these models in the middle with different sticky notes, perhaps different colors representing different things they want to add, different ways they want to change it. And eventually at the end, they'll come and revisit it to make their final model. This is key. Them understanding their models is revisable, because that's the core concept of science. As we gain new knowledge, as we gain new understanding, we can come back and change our models, the way we understand and interact with the world. This also kind of laid out over a framework. It'll encourage their creativity, because again, there's no right way. Each student will have a different way of thinking about that concept. And as they make these models, you can see in the timeline here, they have these times to come and revisit them. That red arrow kind of being them coming at that middle time, revising it, and there's experiments throughout. So it's a very dynamic process of creating these models, revising them, doing different experiments throughout, them incorporating different ideas, them having these discussions throughout, incorporating ideas of their classmates, until collectively as a class, as well as them individually, they come to their final model and their final understanding, their final demonstration of their knowledge.
Yeah, so once they have their first model, then we're going to start doing some experiments and getting some information for students. So this is core principle number 3, and it is bringing new information to students. So there's 2 ways to do this. The first one is through direct instruction. So this could be things like reading a textbook and letting them puzzle around it for a little bit, or giving them a mini lecture called a just-in-time instruction. These are direct instructions, so they're more a traditional classroom style. And students, what is important is that they have a way to integrate this knowledge into what their explanation for the phenomenon will eventually be. So for something that's more direct like this, they might do a graphic organizer like I have on the right. And then the other way that students can get information to add into their model is through doing activities. So activities or experiments can be also reading or paper activities, but they can also be experiments like a gas law experiment in a chemistry class to work with the tanker. So this is an example of an activity that was done for the Yellowstone population in ecology for a high school biology class. And the teacher gave students these 4 graphs and asked them to see if they can find any correlations between these populations. And some students left it in this paper, and some of them cut them out and did them all vertically so that they could compare across the x-axis. And so when students are getting these experiments, you can revise and look back at their model and see if they need any help anywhere. And so it's a great way to be able to tailor what you're doing and see where students might be needing a little bit more help. When students are completing activities, they need to make sure that they are keeping track of them. So part of this principle is to have another talk session after each of the experiments or activities and synthesize what students are seeing. So this is a summary table that some students put together for that ecology phenomenon. And they would do this after every activity. This also works as a great note-keeping thing for your students. And the important thing is that they're not just summarizing what the activity said or what they learned from the activity, but how the information that they gained from the activity helps explain their model or gives them more insight into their model. And so this is, like I said, a great note-keeping tool for students to keep track. And you're going to be having full classroom discussions. And so all those points that Jaron brought up about those talking with students are all really helpful. Try to make sure that you are not signaling any correct answer in all of this. These are all evidence for explanations. And so there isn't really a wrong answer, but there are ones that are more justified by different data. And for this in particular, for students, because they're coming to a scientific consensus within their class using the turn and talk or share pair, or think, pair, share is really, really useful for this. So once we have done all of our activities, remember that we're going to be revising that model in the middle of the activities or about the halfway point of the unit. We need to be able to use that information to make claims. So claims are important in the scientific community, and they're a really difficult thing for students to be able to do, and especially since it's not something we normally do. So it's really important to scaffold what these claims and evidence look like for students. So arguing in science is different than arguing in real life, or like not necessarily real life, but when we think about arguments, we think about very volatile things. And so arguments in science are a lot more low-key for the most part. And so for students who are worried about offending or making their friend upset, you can talk to them about what happens if you have an argument about the type of pizza. Do you start punching each other over your favorite type of pizza, or do you justify it with information? So scaffolding is really important to be able to have students understand how to do this. And another thing that students really need to be able to do is figure out how to critique one another in a scientific context. So you can use these single or pair worksheets where they have claim, evidence, reasoning, which is from the previous, and then this is given to a peer to critique, and then it's revised. So we have another revision in here. And for students who are learning how to do critiques or make claims, they might need some help. So we have some sentence starters over here that you can read yourself if you want to pause. And these are really helpful for getting students to figure out what vocabulary does it look like when we disagree scientifically, or if we're making a claim scientifically. So once we have our claims and evidence, the last thing we're going to do is put our final model together. So the final model is a lot different from the first model that students are making. The final model is focused on an explanation of phenomenon. And for you as a teacher, you'll need to guide students in what to include in that model. So that includes a gotta have list. If you have older students, they can determine their gotta have list. You can provide scaffolding. So for the tanker implosion, you might have some strategically placed magnifying glass to look at things from a molecular standpoint. And you can also have students review their mid-unit revisions that they've made. So this is the revisions from one class. and what they thought during different lessons. So if you, after these models, would like to do an assessment, it's important to make sure that you have high and low cognitive tasks that you're asking students to do. After you get these models, you might be like, yes, students know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They can totally make this work on a different scenario, but that's a really big ask for a lot of students, and one missing piece can make it go wrong. So it's important to get a full picture of what your students know. And so asking those lower cognitive tasks will help make sure that students know everything. And then having those higher cognitive tasks can be really a creative endeavor for a lot of students. So you can do tests and stuff with this. Nothing against it, but you want to make sure that you're getting a full picture of what your students know. And if you're interested in these AST models, remember that you're not alone. So the book recommends that if you're really interested in this, that you make 2 or maybe 3 units that are new every year, and don't try to go much more than that. And if you have colleagues to work with, that's a great thing. You can work with your professional learning community to do this and look at what's working for your school. And if you don't have extra colleagues, you can also look online for the Ambitious Science Teaching community. So they have some units that are already made, or thoughts on what you could use, like the tanker one that we used. So you're not alone, and I hope that this is very exciting to you if you're thinking about trying to emphasize the scientific process to your students. So I really love this book. It combined a lot of the things that I really liked, which were process focused on looking at what students know and how they know. And also the difficulties that I have with college students, or had with college students, in learning about science, especially college freshmen, and learning how to follow their own data to their conclusions and to feel justified in what they've done. So I could imagine it's a really difficult ask in college. So I imagine that students who had this in high school or middle school or even elementary school sometimes, that this would just build and build and build into a really great set of skills. Jaron?
I also really love this book. AST provides a great framework that's much more approachable than the traditional science approach. And because that brings a lot more students, hopefully increases that interest in science. Provides a great tool for us as future science teachers to be able to make science much more interesting and personable for our students. Hopefully creating a new wave of new scientists, or much more inclined science thinking people.
Yeah, learning about the scientific process and being more okay with the way that it works and the uncertainty is going to serve us a lot better in the long run. And we've definitely seen what a lack of that understanding means for our general environment and population. So we hope you enjoyed our presentation and you want to read the book. Feel free to leave us a comment on what you want to know more about.